Hello everyone, today we talk about the Latin Empire of Romania Army Organization. This is the first time we talk about the Latin Empire in a dedicated video at least. So today we will simply look at the very few actually that we know about its army. In terms of organization, we will talk about battles specifically which the Latin Empire took place in other dedicated videos, so a better analysis will be there. But what we can say already is that, generally speaking, we're talking about this 13th century of not even 60 years. I mean, you're talking about 1204, 1261, and therefore of an experience that is often considered like sort of an unavoidable failure, or at least a state, a structure that, similarly to what is often also said about the Outremer states, was seen as rigged fundamentally, as if the Latins, the Westerners, had no shot in managing these lands whatsoever. The case of the Latin Empire, studying its military history really helps, fundamentally speaking, because at a certain point he was crippled at the point probably of non-return, but even in here we can't properly be so deterministic. And I would like to stress, in simple outline, without getting too much in detail into the thing, given that we will surely discuss this from a broader historical point of view, not just from the army organization part, of fundamentally of the normality of the character of this army, and for 13th century Western standards, and from a political point of view, also a social one, but from as far as we can see now, how it was somewhat functional to the situation, right? And that the problems that it had to face were somewhat, not necessarily even greater than itself, but definitely hard. And that's the advice I always give to any kind of judge of these historical realities. That in these times you cannot see even one single power in existence not being a step away from complete disgregation. Right, there's not the tough power that always, even when you look at those countries and peoples that more or less you can easily identify. Also, I can say in modern national terms, but at least there can be an evident continuity from the political structures of those times, of the most structured kingdoms, especially in fact in Western Europe. You realize that it makes an enormous difference to have political unity, a central system, something that, in fact, in the West was being developed and enhanced, and having something that instead is fallen apart, right? You can't have the same people that speaks the same language, but the point is that as it would remain, that's another thing we rarely think of, historically speaking, as if one country conquers another and subjugates it for centuries. That people disappear, so it's not the same thing, or that history is forgotten. This is really not the case. There are realities, however, that didn't make it. And as far as the Byzantine Empire is concerned, in this case, well, the Latin one basically was established on its own ruin, right? At least as far as the centralized statal bureaucratic system was involved. How did they make it? Well, they made it exactly because of what we've said before about the intrinsic fragility of systems. And otherwise, in the case of the Byzantine Empire, people say, after Manuel the First, everything went downhill. Well, actually not, right? The empire was faring decently well. It had reached actually a very important level of power. You can obtain an important victory over a city, especially if it's in political crisis. Actually, it was famously enough the same Byzantines called, at least for dynastic reasons, called the Venetians and the French to seize the throne for them. And the thing went out of hand. The Crusaders entered the city, coated, sacked it, and that was actually a negative thing for Constantinople, that basically would never be the same. It would be an empty trunk, right after that. There's no comparison between the Crusaders' sack and one of the Ottomans, right? Also, the Ottomans made of Constantinople another great city once again. The 1204 Crusade is also, and just to tell you how I can express this judgment without any hypocrisy, in the sense that I actually look not much favorably at the thing how it unfolded, but I don't think it's the most of the time the narrative those freaking Western barbarians arrived in this. No, it didn't. That's not the point, right? That was a serious issue that was caused both by the Byzantines and the Crusaders, and the experience that follows doesn't deserve to be stigmatized, in fact, as this dark thing, this oppressive colonialists, right? How seriously? I mean, even for, I think that a certain historiography of the Crusade came up with the idea of this, how silly it is to make historical comparisons that have nothing to do with each other, like that the Crusaders in the Near East was the first European experience of colonialism. You see, when there are these parallelisms, you can't basically there is no historical substance whatsoever, right? And I am also actually a great fan of the Crusader states, as far as especially Schwerpunkt had given me the opportunity to deepen in their history, which otherwise I didn't know much. And the more I studied, the more I learned about that, and the more I realized that the Crusader states of Outremer had actually a hell of a potential. Like, they weren't doomed at all, right? The story that they were, even in there, they were doomed, that deterministically they couldn't make it because they were intrinsically, they didn't know how to rule the place, because they were culturally stupid substantially, because that's the only possible explanation that you can give in the face of no historical evidence whatsoever, and that they had to succumb. This is absolutely not true, right? Just studying even here, just the political military history of it, shows you that they did pretty damn well. And generally speaking, all polities tend to do well overall. That is, what they do wrong is at levels that have nothing to do with being stupid because you arrive in a land that you don't know how to cope with it. Well, the same thing has been said for Romania, right? For the former lands conquered from the Roman Empire, and so this kind of colonialistic exploit of the locals, we will see today how that is. You don't need to see, if you're speaking of cruelty, which surely existed. It's not that a French knight that settled in Thessaly or in Peloponnese was necessarily treating the local peasantry better than they did in Anjou or in Provence, right? The divides at that point surely might have been increased because these were foreigners. They had another confession, they spoke another language. But I mean, who doesn't? Like, find me a foreign domination that doesn't incur into these kind of problems. And let's rather see the fact that many locals, many Greeks, many Slavs, and so on, actually sided with in fact, with the Latins, and for evident political, military, social interests, they did it like everywhere. So the main problem in which the problem should be framed, in my opinion, is realizing the fact that, albeit the fall of the empire in 1204 is to be considered, in a certain perspective, definitely a victory of feudalism, of Western feudalism over another model that was specifically the Roman one, but that is similar to other areas of the Mediterranean, especially as the centralistic traditions are concerned, right? Mostly the Byzantines and the Muslims were all part of the Roman legacy of centralization since the times for the Romans since ever, for the Muslims from the great caliphates. But the important divide is that when the Latins conquer Constantinople, this thing is transformed into in fact a feudal state, which again, as we'll see, it has its own advantages. There was no other way to make it work differently, properly, because there really the cultural differences were too deep, right? And even in there, it's not a matter of saying, the Crusaders were stupid because they couldn't make plumbing functioning in the city. Maybe they were poor administrators, maybe they had other goals, but you have to understand in there what they were there for and why they behaved like that, and what they expected to get, especially from that experience. Because, as you know, the outcome, let's say, at least of the Fourth Crusade, was very random, right? It triggers me when people do not know the story and say, they started because they wanted, it was that wicked pope that wanted to conquer Constantinople. It didn't start like that at all, right? The papacy actually had nothing to do with that, if not when Constantinople was already fallen, and they said, okay, well, let's exploit it at least. But that's not how it went. And there could be more to say, right? Especially if you see this event as the episode within itself, and you lose the broader picture of how such of what was happening in Europe altogether that time, and what was the enormous kinetic energy of the West now over the East from one century. Basically, you can't realize why such a thing could happen. And it was a clamorous success in many ways. Now, the problem is that feudalism is something you cannot keep together in a centralized fashion, especially in a land that has just seen the collapse of a statal and administrative system, right? This is no France, where you have basically, even if the monarchy fell apart, you still had many different feudal states on their own, these extremely powerful families that ruled in the land from centuries. Here, it's a new world, right? And there is surely a difficulty to cope with it, but in my opinion, the Latins here didn't play badly. The cleverest were definitely the Venetians, who said, even if we have our own share, technically, of land by right, we give it all to the French because we don't give a damn to it. We just want the ports, right? The Venetians were the ones that were the Crusaders, were sacking the city and destroying, took home all this amazing Roman artifacts. In fact, can still be seen in Venice from the sack of Constantinople. But especially, they were absolutely coherent about their natural choice as a maritime republic to just occupy these strongholds, coastal strongholds. That was all what they were interested in for the trade with the East. Surely the feudal structure was something else, right? That surely was divided. It was difficult to keep together. But at the same time, there are signs, as we will see, of an attempt which was done by all feudal powers when they conquered a new land that especially had not known feudalism. This can be easily seen in England or in Sicily. The Romania was, something yet different and greater because than the previous things. But it at the same time, it was also it offered this, in fact, central structures to start administering things from a less decentralized way. Then I think failed at the end of the day. But as we were saying also the other day, with talking about across the 14th, 15th century Roman Empire, that aside from the reconquest of Constantinople in 1261 from the Palaiologoi, the Franks, the Latins, remained actually in Greece for a long time, right? And the situation we also made a video in May was about medieval Greece, specifically looking at all these various entities, and in there we explained it a little bit. So if you want to look at that, I don't know where it is, like if it's medieval Europe playlist, because I haven't created medieval Greece playlist yet. But if we insist on these areas, we will have to. So after the fall of Constantinople in 1204, the Franks had basically divided the Byzantine Empire amongst themselves. Right? It was the Latin Emperor Baldwin receiving 1/4, and the Venetian and Frankish Crusaders the remaining 3/4, probably 3/8 each. So these lands were divided up and parceled in turn out in groups of different knights fees, right? Properly the number of knights fees. We're talking about 200, 100, 70, 60, 40, 20, 10, 7, or 6. So these were the districts fundamentally that were distributed by the vassals amongst their retainers. And that's feudalism in a nutshell. I give you the land, so that's basically a prepaid military service that I give you all the land, I give you all the wealth that is needed. Actually, this and then you render the service from a military point of view. At this time, we know how we made several videos about this, how monetized warfare actually was, also in the feudal realities. So at the end of the day, it was still about the money that you could pay these guys. But the first settlement, the first route, that I presume has been very disorderly in certain situations. Consider that there were after the fall of Constantinople, there were certain Byzantine rump states, not notably just the Empire in Nicaea, from which the Palaiologi would eventually reconquer Constantinople, but others around that would in fact also have an important role after the re-establishment of the Roman Empire, let alone, of course, they never thought it had fallen. And you can imagine at this point even the means through which this seizure was actually carried out. So the greater vassals each received their fiefs in two parts, one within the emperor's own lands near Constantinople and the other in the provinces. This is fascinating because it's first hint of what we were saying before, that it wasn't just, okay, everybody seizes whatever they want. I give you some, basically here I think that probably the Latin emperor was exploiting the original Constantinopolitan military organization infrastructures that contemplated an army of Constantinople proper and then the provincial ones. And this was a very clever way for a feudal power to say, if you want more land, I mean, in part you can get it whatever you want in this huge freaking thing that we have conquered, and also consider that the further you went from Constantinople, and the most problematic it became. I mean, it's not, I don't know, the Bulgarians, for example, were famously woken up by this thing again. They participate. So lots of Balkanic powers, also other Balkanic powers, were interested in the thing. From the other, you have, however, I give you some land here close to Constantinople too, but at that point, you know, you're subject to my own control, and therefore I can dispose of you, in a bit of a more centralistic fashion that than just like how even, I don't know, France could have been. Even if Paris was already this important capital, but there is no comparison with Constantinople. It literally had swallowed everything else throughout all the whole empire. In fact, everybody hated them. But the only other real city of the empire was Thessalonica. For the rest, it was just an enormous Constantinopolitan estate. That is, all the major all these households of Constantinople, these great aristocratic families of Constantinople had created on their own. Crete, for example, was notoriously, during Komnenian times, in fact, an imperial household on its own. It was a big farm for the Komnenians, and so on. So that's how also, actually, the establishment of feudal system was not so dramatically breaking with pre-existing structures. I mean, of course, the Byzantine Empire never gotten feudal, but I mean, in terms of, you know, the privatization of powers, all these major Constantinopolitan families, and even the pronoia system that was a bit like the Atkai, I don't know, in Egypt, but it was never feudalism, but it was definitely tending towards that direction. Also by actual Western influence. I often said how Manuel Comnenus actually pushed for the settlement of a lot of Western knights, especially exactly to try to counter even certain internal pushes from the local nobility, from the fact that he probably spotted that feudalism had something to offer in terms of readily available resources, and a general control, especially on the manpower. right? It was a big clienteling system, in which the more people you attracted, right, the more money this thing was still rich, right? So that's also why initially sacking, especially the most important center, yeah, that was not probably clever. But at the same time, they realized, in my opinion, that whatever the situation was, if they hadn't carried that out, they would have had this constantly hostile situation, because naturally what they could hope for, right? They could co-opt now the Byzantine aristocracy or whatever. It was obviously about conquering the place and settling in a brutal form, to control it. There was no option. This thing, in fact, wasn't even properly planned. That's the serious problem. They actually did the most obvious thing at that point. However, the basis of military service in the Latin Empire, drawn up in 1205, was that when the emperor and his senior Venetian and Frankish vassals decided that a campaign was necessarily all knights, Venetians, and as well as Franks, were automatically obliged to serve for a period of 4 months, from June the 1st to September 29th. This is all so fascinating because it's a longer period than, and especially the standardization of it is something you don't find much else in Western Europe at this time. So that's another proof that we're trying to exploit this a continuity in military service that had existed in the Byzantine army as well. And that because the local infrastructure, the local communities were up to this task, right? Also, in case of invasion, this service could be required as long as the emperor and nobility deemed necessary, and that's something that it's also normal. Everything was much more fluid than it sounds, as we'll see, especially also for the amount of troops that could be actually levied through this, because on paper, all kingdoms actually could levy, I don't know, thousands of knights. In reality, it was a challenge to be able to do it even. But let's say that all of the Frankish conquests which resulted from the Fourth Crusade, precise details of organization are known for only one of the states established within the old Roman territories. That was the Principality of Achaia, also known as Morea. Also because the rule there, the Frankish rule there continued for a longer time. And as with all other Frankish conquests in the east, the organization involved the application of the conquered to the conquered territories of current feudal practices, as we have seen. The Principality of Achaia is no exception, and it was divided into 12 baronies with estates varying from 4 knights' fees right up to 24. Noticeably, there are multiples of 4 in this account, which is probably also another way of saying there was some monetization involved. I mean, it wasn't necessarily just an organic structure, but let's say the thieves were monetized in a way, and with many lesser estates of 1 fee or a half fee each, some even held by Greeks, right? So still, even in here, we see a continuity with the previous vassals that, of course, were not overthrown. These are pre-industrial. There is no coercive capability to dislodge people en masse, right? This is what I would like to leave you with more than else. I mean, the realization that this Latin Empire was not something that could be held through a brutal, merciless oppression of its inhabitants, right? If that was the case, it was because all governments of whichever land were brutal and oppressive at the time. But all of them couldn't exist without the support, the decisive majority of the local forces. And that's also why how they could exist, and this naturally involves a negotiation of tolerance, a ratio of force. There were also, of course, 7 ecclesiastical Byronies, right? 6 or 4 fees held by bishops, and 1 in Achaia itself, actually, of 8 fees held by an archbishop, as well as 3 estates belonging to the military orders, with Templars, Hospitallers, in Teutonic knights holding 4 fees each, right? Remember that here formerly the Latin Empire was a Catholic one. That's why it was called Latin, and this naturally involved the settlement of the clergy, of the ecclesiastic, of the high clergy as well. That was, of course, in feudal Europe, to lead their men to war, and that had special privileges and power, and so on. So even in here, there was an overlapping probably with the pre-existing. With the Orthodox Church, and naturally, this also didn't mean that religion changed for everybody, of course. But the importance is still the control from the side of ecclesiastical elites, also important fiefs. The service from the larger estates was based on the holding of 4 fees, which was obliged up to supply 14 horsemen consisting of the vassal, that was the banneret knight, then a second knight, and 12 sergeants. Estates over 4 fees had to supply an extra knight or 2 sergeants for each additional fee. So in the case of a single fee or half fee, the vassal, knight, or sergeant respectively served alone and in person. And this is also fascinating in terms especially of strictly resources and possible living capabilities. Here there were, as you understand, multiple fees holders that had essentially a core fee, and then others that at parity of size had, however, with these additional fees, provide less, right? That is important because naturally the larger the units you have to provide altogether, because these were like big territorial seigneuries, they had a coherence altogether, and the more you have to levy, and the more difficult it becomes, right? This is also a very Clausewitzian concept altogether regarding the Trinity, especially. So it was accepted that, of course, the more you had, the more difficult was extensionally to provide for the same amount of troopers than just a more contained fief could. A more contained seigneury, let's say, in terms of fees holding, was concerned, say, better. Then we have also, in the case of a single fee or a half fee, so we're talking about the vassal was respectively a knight or a sergeant, right? Serve alone and in person, right? Because evidently there were also these kind of smaller ones, and these people had naturally to be eventually put together with the others that had much larger retinues, as you understand. So, as also in the Kingdom of Jerusalem, all vassals were expected to serve in person up to the age of 60, after which a son or a tenant might substitute. This was also the proof of a more centralized system too. And it's like a bit the Kingdom of Jerusalem was at the beginning, of course. That's another example of how feudalism was established in areas where it was previously inexistent, and therefore there was this possibility from the monarchy to retain, to structure from the start a more central system with a more balanced equilibrium among the fiefs that naturally were necessary, because that was the thing, that was the most effective way to provide the best troops, that is knights, in an important number, given they were always the minority, of course, of the total troops, the local levies, militias, mercenaries, as we'll see now. But still, the personal involvement was important, because that meant that you could literally control the individuals. You could, politically speaking, that was a consequence and a cause of a greater centralization of power as well. Then, even in here, the thing was more fluid than it sounded, but namely, it was established like this. Naturally, you have to think that the Outremer experience had a considerable impact even in here. They were in the East from more than one century, so they knew how to handle the thing in a non-feudal reality as that. In addition to the standard 4 months service that, as we've seen during the season, garrison duty was required for a further 4 months a year. What does it mean? It means that in theory I don't have to pay you, right? It's not that these people went away. They simply guarded the place. Naturally, many of these knights, as we will see, also were not always physically in these possessions. Talking mostly about French crusaders that came from important families that had holdings, I don't know, in France, in Sicily, in this broader Guelph Angevin system that stretched from the Channel now to the Aegean. And that's important because evidently there wasn't these were not people that devoted themselves simply to live now in Greece or wherever and for the rest of their lives. They had important interests. There was a lot of coming and going, lots of other wars all the time. So think, I don't know, the War of the Vespers, the intervention of Aragon. There was all over the Mediterranean, there was a valid reason for coming and going, and that's what these people normally did throughout their own life. I mean, the history here, the 13th century is the peak of feudalism, just even like as a lifestyle. So this attempt to say, okay, maybe you have to guard the place for a certain time, that's due to you. We want that. From the side of the emperor was a necessity. And even the remaining 4 months of the year, there could present some summons from the prince, in this case of Achaia, if the need should arise. The service could also be demanded overseas. Prince William was certainly accompanied, for example, by 400 Achaean knights in Cyprus in 1249 and in Italy in 1268. So it's interesting to see how even the vassals of the empire were the greatest landlords were issuing this kind of centralizing measures for the fiefs, which means, to speak in a universal language, of we have to make the thing work as far as we are in charge, right? And we don't have just to let this opportunity slip out of our hands. So this system altogether permitted the maintenance of an almost permanent feudal army, and the number of troops that could be thus summoned was, as we were saying, on paper, considerable. Right, at Bodonitsa, for example, in 1250, William was accompanied by 800 knights, and up to 1,000 are recorded on another occasion. And, however, these represent probably the full feudal master, right? How much they could squeeze from the whole land. There are naturally, how many were, these were knights, right? I don't know, we find larger numbers, of course, as many as 8,000 Achaeans are recorded in a campaign in 1246. While at Pelagonia there were allegedly 1,200 infantry, in addition to an improbable 8,000 horsemen, of whom, in any case, a minority would have actually been knights. Consider that, as we were saying before, after the collapse of the Roman state, after the Crusade, the frontiers had become dramatically more permeable, so it was plenty of marauders, raiders, and mercenaries, and everything all together. I mean, even the single individual Balkanic princes who would invade these places could adjust the situation at their own please, and so it was always plenty of troops, right? I presume that actually this area of Europe, broader, yeah, I mean, speaking especially of the southern Balkans or Greece, and even the western coast of Asia Minor was freaking full of all the possible mercenaries you could imagine, right? Not just because simply, I don't know, think about the Catalan Company later, but I mean, we know even the Palaiologoi regularly, and famously also the Byzantines had hired especially these swarms of light horsemen. See, it was plenty of horse archers, this tradition coming from the Nordic Pontic well, not just Nordic. At that point, it was this broader influence received by Constantinople from the east. Lots of horse archers, nomadic peoples that could be found swarming from passing the corridor between the Black Sea and the Carpathians up into Thrace, and many Balkanic powers hired and employed such troops on a regular base. So the most obvious parallelism is the one with the Turcopoles that the Crusaders already used in the East in an extensive way. And in the video about the Turcopoles, we even saw how many native Greeks actually began to serve namely as Turcopoles, because they began. This is something that can be observed at the collapse of certain statal structures. This was seen, in fact, with Romania, was seen with the collapse of Swabian Sicily. You know that when these big systems collapse, lots of young. There's a deep crisis. Many young people just go out there for fighting for a living, and technically we have this. And Turcopoles, by the way, could be, as we've seen in the case of Cyprus, that was controlled by the same people who held collectively the sum of the titles, even with these Latin principalities, even had Turcopole knights proper. I mean, as heavy as the rest, as heavy as the elite could be. So everything could be very varied, but it was also easy to raise troops. And this was also very large land, so resources were there. Throughout the empire, auxiliary troops were supplied usually by the local populace, both Greeks and Slavs. In Achaia, the Slavs were principally from the Peloponnesian Melingi tribe, was still favored by the Catalans in the 14th century, and if the Catalans favored, somebody, it's because even if they were as good as them. And an army raised in the Duchy of Athens in 1304 contained as many as 6,000 Thessalian and Bulgarian cavalry. The Bulgarian mercenaries were employed frequently even in Cyprus during the 14th century. We see it in the video on the Cypriot army organization during late Middle Ages, and these specific Thessalian Bulgarian cavalry were employed 1304 under 18 Greek nobles that were possibly organized in Allagia, that was basically a Byzantine form of organization. So there were naturally, and this speaks for the kind of privatization of the same Byzantine military system that was now providing troops also for the new rulers. Plus, there were, together with this considerable 6,000 cavalry, 30,000 mixed infantry, chiefly Greeks and Slavs. Right. We know also 34,000 Greek infantry recorded in the Athenian army at the Battle of Cephissus in 1311. The massive defeat against the Catalans. So this also proves, by the way, that the Franks were absolutely, in these times, very thoughtful about the infantry resources. Don't get me started about this, because I'm writing a thesis that is specifically about this. I quoted often Cephissus as an example, but I mean this myth that the Franks, the Westerners were just disadapted feudal bastards who didn't understand it. It's a complete historical myth. And they were always very aware of the capabilities of infantry. They weren't absolutely fanatics who thought that infantry didn't exist. Actually, the class, let's call it in this way, that could recognize best the power of any arm at that time were the knights, right? And recognizing the infantry capabilities pretty damn well as well. So the myth, there was a time in which the feudal knight was oblivious of infantry capability, never existed. It's an invention that, for people that want to make a simplistic explanation of how to motivate the feats of cavalry at this point, that actually very few with that. The Slavs usually supplied archers and spearmen. This is a bit interesting combination, and that proves also actually a greater amount of, the West at this point was, in terms of missile troops, were mostly crossbowmen. The fact that in the East, in the Balkans, also archery was something more delicate is actually well known, and these were also tough mountaineer populations. The Balkan hinterlands has always been a nightmare, so they would do pretty well. And this combination, archers, spearmen, also speaks, generally speaking, for a anti-cavalry function, especially the light one, and is to be seen, I don't know, at the Crusade of Smyrna, for example, half a century later. Important also Western European contingents were sent against the Turks in the same way, right? These guys had to cope with Tartars, with everything that is steps every once in a while sent at waves against them, right? And these types of Slavic archers and spearmen are specifically mentioned in an Achaean army of 1296. Many of these troops were supplied to the Frankish army by the Byzantine archontes, that were these eventually noblemen. So also more or less tied with the previous political and administrative system. So they were simple lords who the Franks had, in case they were, already title holders, are confirmed in their possessions, or simply they were landowners, and they were also pronoi properly. And we'll look at this in the Byzantine military organization. So even here, a lot of continuity with the previous system. The contingents provided by the archontes were probably the same, and they had been obliged to supply to the Byzantine army previous days. However, the number of troops varied considerably, as these were quite heterogeneous territorial lordships, and these were usually the nobiliar retinues rather than the levies, actually, for many reasons. I mean, the same ones for which, even in the West, was now, especially towards the end of the 13th century, this contraction of lower classes, and an increase of this specialization and professionalization of troopers, and especially of the knights, so that the divide between those who fought and those who in theory could but would prefer to stay home actually increased, or simply they couldn't fight, because at the end of the day, and actually the Byzantine territories were probably more like that compared to Europe, that had to Western Europe, that had more let's say dynamic middle classes, important autonomies, important cities, like the phenomenon of urbanism that we have outlined very often in Schwerpunkt was striking at the time. So we can imagine this thing to have been dominated largely by cavalry as well, right? If anything, also for the numbers of the horse archers that in the West didn't exist, right? And so infantry was important as well, especially in function of the latter. But as far as the heavily equipped were concerned, either you find some freaking beast like the Catalan company that can stop even cavalry charges and take this big victory. Cephissus, that is the only one actually from the Catalans in terms of infantry victory during the 14 years war, the beginning of 14th century, excuse me. But that otherwise is, mostly light troops. That it doesn't mean that they are less important. On the contrary, because the area will also, I don't know, we were talking about Nicopolis. This is just 100 years later. It's not that so many things had changed. I mean, the importance of the coordination of various arms and horse archery, and the lack even of a strong infantry could arrive even to defeat heavy cavalry in certain cases. And there would be a lot to tell also relatively to the, for example, the cavalries, I don't know, of the Bulgarians or of the Serbians and so on, because those were also, but the Byzantines also had their own famous tradition in that regard, they had been able to integrate, or sometimes simply to replicate perfectly all the various cavalries, or these mostly in fact mounted peoples they had to cope with during the centuries. Also, all the mercenaries that they usually bought now wanted to still find a job, and they knocked at the Frankish door, and otherwise they would retaliate on their own land, which definitely happened for the sake of pay. Also because they did mostly the same thing. I mean, when you hire horse archery, it's not that you actually pay them. You just let them loot and keep the loot, right? This is what can't be seen everywhere, like even in Hungary with the Cumans, or that was the normal relation. Otherwise, they mostly had there was a negative prejudice towards these nomads, because they didn't give a damn about local matters at all. Which is also convenient, because after you employ them, they go back where they came from, unless you want to use them in a more profitable term. I don't know Franks here in the Latin Empire actually settling nomads, but it's possible given how it had been fairly common in also in previous times, in Byzantine times. And we know relatively to the Archontes troops that in 1205, a certain Theodore Branas agreed to supply as many as 500 men. And these were all Byzantine subjects that shifted their loyalty to the Frankish rule, right, as an habitual thing. And it's, in fact, if they had been disaffected with them, probably the same Frankish rule could have not lasted so long. Even the same conquest, in a way, could have not happened in certain terms. But surely there was discontent too, as we were saying at the beginning. And there were other practices that were carried out to balance the thing. I mean, for example, in 1211, there were certain Nicaean prisoners of war that were incorporated in the Frankish army under their own officers, right, by the second Latin Emperor Henry of Flanders. And this was probably way more common than we think, also because manpower and skilled troops are rare to find, so you don't just slaughter. I mean, you can do that depending on what your current interest is, but at the same time it's a precious asset you would think twice before dispensing of. And just as in the Near East, there was for the Latins a shortage of manpower, right, in Greece and in Romania. And over time, however, as the Latin power grew weaker, the locals also would take over more easily and altogether carve their own space into this huge territory at the expense not just of the Latins, but eventually also of the reconquered Paleologan Roman Empire. Other auxiliaries included Turks and Cumans, the latter be found in alliance with the empire from 1239. There were apparently Cumans present in the Achaean army defeated at Pelagonia in 1259. Some Turks settled in Achaia after 1262. Some were even knighted and granted fiefs. Remember the Turcopoles, what we were saying before, right? These were actual Turks. This is just for saying, by the way, I made a video on specifically Franks and Byzantines in the Seljuk army. Well, here it's repaid. Consider that even some Roman emperors were at the service of the Sultanate of Rome in their youth as soldiers. So that tells you also how permeable, actually, think about this in terms of military culture, technology, fighting styles, right? We know, as we were saying before, it was plenty of Westerners actually in the Paleologan army at this time in Nicaea. There was the many Acritae were actually French, German, these nationalities in here. So think what this all means, and especially in terms of the broader, this all, and we're just speaking of land. I mean, think of what was happening at sea with the Genoese, with the Venetians. it was like the kind of we're the same with the Catalans on land. I mean, we're the center of some of the greatest accomplishments of technology or tactics of the time. And think about what a school this was, and how overlooked actually this theater is, historically speaking. Nobody seems to give much of a damn. But it's a specific sector on its own, should receive a much greater credit, at least as far as popular awareness is concerned. And we have actually, after the ascent of Charles of Anjou to the Achaean throne in 1278, so you know that Charles was brother of Louis IX of France, deeply involved in the Crusades still, and Count of Provence, and King of Sicily. Well, in Achaia, he increases markedly the use of Turkish and Bulgarian auxiliaries, and in addition, he brings Saracen archers from his Sicilian possession to serve principally as garrison troops. This is fascinating because, orientatively speaking, I mean, among all these ethnicities, especially among the Bulgarians, were also, robustly heavy knights. But we're talking altogether also of a kind of archery, right? The Turks, the Saracens, generally speaking, but also the Bulgarians had important archery traditions, horse archery too, especially in case of the Turks and the Bulgarians. And so these are these lighter troops that are needed to protect, to guard, to beat this also readily deployable troops that are not dramatically expansive, but that are importantly skilled. They can keep at bay multiple opponents unless basically have heavier cavalry. That's a wise choice. And you see in here, we see places like Anatolia, Greece, Italy, even as far as Spain, the Balkans. So the French, these are mostly French. There are the Venetians. There are these also this broader context with the rest of the Latin East, this steppes peoples from the Pontic area. So you have really an astonishing amount of influences. In fact, we will have to, by the way, this is about the army organization, but we will have to make a video on all various troops typologies as far as they are documented archaeologically, iconographically, historically, and so on. So it's quite important. And let's not forget there were also many Western European mercenaries altogether in the Latin Empire proper, because these guys were all over the place, literally. You could find them everywhere. Probably Western, from the most feudal areas of the West. There had been historically this expansion. We talked about it many times. Also, Central European monarchies hiring all these guys from the Frankish area that were pouring out of the continent. And since a long time at this point, now the whole thing was generalized and also framed, as we've seen, in a more dynamic war market, highly monetized and so on. We find it everywhere. We find it in the service of the Muslims and the Byzantines before this, and still during this, in the rump states. You find them everywhere. And often, right? And there was an army of allegedly 60,000, which is an exaggeration, recorded under Emperor Baldwin II in 1239. Well, this contained Frenchmen, Venetians, Franks/Latins, so various other nationalities, and plus the base of Greeks, Muslims, and Cumans. Remember the comparison we said now, the enormous multi-ethnicity of these armies. I honestly never saw them, right? Not even Muslim armies were so multi-ethnic. This is a specific reality, exceptional reality after the collapse of the empire. 60,000 here, means a lot, right? At this time, you don't realistically have armies that go. I mean, if you already have something like 3,000 knights or 30,000 infantry, namely, it's huge. It's freaking huge. Like, in the West, there are things like this, but are episodic. It's unrealistic that the Latin Empire could mobilize this. but it just means a lot. Sources always make this decision, especially the eastern you go, or at least in the least, this areas also where these geographical traditions are a bit more, let's say, conceptual and ideal. But you read 60,000, it means a lot, right? And you can stay sure that it was actually a lot in relative terms, indeed, but also in absolute, approaching the absolute. And we shouldn't be surprised, however, in this regard, that there were so many foreign mercenaries and auxiliaries that if we have enumerated, because that's also the character that in a moment of instability comes to happen, that everybody joins. I mean, this is a character, I've been studying it for a while, in certain other regions that were particularly fragmented from a political point of view. See, everybody joins. There is a big campaign, there's a big lord, big guy here, I don't know, the Latin Emperor is waging campaign somewhere, the Prince of Achaia is doing. Lots of people go together with them, right? They don't even ask for permission to just raid around. And this naturally increases the power, the same magnitude of the army, as long as there are money to be paid or loot to be made. And this is how war is made at this point. The Romanian armies alone, like standing on their narrow feudal base, were very small, right? We know of Henry, for example, having only 2,000 men at Philippopolis in 1208, of whom like more than 300 were Greeks, and as few as 260 knights plus sergeants and infantry, we think, at Lake Apollonia in 1211, though in 1206 he had raised a somewhat larger feudal army of 600 knights plus 10,000 infantry. Now, I don't have all the data, like all the various, it would be interesting to make an account of all the various, throughout all the various sources, the various contingents that were filled in here. And it's interesting to see this important infantry presence that, given the largeness of it, speaks also for a kind of a lighter character next to the obvious bulk of the heavily armored knights. So, as we were saying, the Frankish presence in Greece lasted far beyond the Latin Empire of Romania. After 1261, when Constantinople was reconquered by the Empire Nicaea, by the Palaiologoi. By that time, it seems that there was an establishment of a full-time, regularly paid garrison of 1,000 men for the city. And actually, the way the Nicaeans managed to retake it was embarrassing. It happened in a blink of an eye. It was a coup, basically, not a siege. And that speaks also for the difficulties of managing such an imposing structure. Because, let's be honest, Constantinople was by far the largest thing there, and in terms as a city, as a broader system to control. So even just maintaining it costs a freaking lot. This is to be seen in Western Europe also, where cities are expanding rapidly. The local communities need consistent expenses just to pay the garrison duties and so on. Can't imagine for a city like Constantinople. Thereafter, titular Latin emperors that, of course, drifted about Europe in search of military aid for the reconquest of their empire. Let's say this is normal. It's just like when Jerusalem fell. We still have the kings of Jerusalem that by title, and in 1267. And also, as we've seen, also because the various principalities that remained, and Charles of Anjou promised to provide the titular Emperor Baldwin II with 2,000 knights, which is a hell of an army, for a year's service towards the recovery of Constantinople. Consider that Charles of Anjou had conquered Sicily specifically for conquering Constantinople, therefore achieving where the Hohenstaufen had failed, and definitely from a different standpoint. And this was we also talked about it actually in the Byzantine Manualistic phase, where actually there was a time in which Constantinople could easily fall, and the reason why the Sicilian Vespers happened is exactly thanks to, and not much just of a kind of a popular thing, as it's been romantically seen, but more practically an Aragonese and Byzantine and Palaeologan policy to make the island rise against and establishing essentially an Aragonese rule. But it was feasible, and in fact, as we know, it's not that the Byzantines were faring any better at that point. And so by a treaty of 1281, the same Charles and the titular Emperor Charles de Courtenay were to provide 8,000 knights for another expedition planned for 1283, to which Venice promised to contribute 40 or more galleys. Right, naval power here was the key. The Sicilian kingdom didn't have much, so they had to rely mostly on the Venetians that also didn't excessively like the idea of any power becoming too important, especially between Italy and the Balkans, where it could choke them into the Adriatic. But definitely Venice at this point had become kind of the villain for the Byzantines, because now they were allied with the Genoese. Right, the Palaeologi managed basically to reconquer most of the Gen by subcontracting the resources of the various islands reconquered to the Genoese. That made a fortune. Venice didn't like it at all, as those were their main Italian rivals, and they act contrarily. Right, then eventually, over time, things will readjust. The diplomatic events here are very, very, very complicated. Right, I can tell you, I study mostly the 90s of the 13th century, the first half of the 14th. It's a freaking mess. Like, it's the first time, objectively, in history, we have that amount of actual documents to realize. To say it's pretty damn complicated, and it's a pure lesson of realpolitik. Gradually, however, the concept of even a titular Latin emperor faltered and died. Right, there was no way that there was also the crisis of the 14th century. So the age of the big universalistic ambitions kind of failed. Right, and this was sadly true for the same Romans who, albeit having reconquered Constantinople, would never regain never get close to regain the power they had formerly enjoyed. Right, and that was a brutal break in parentheses between the two periods. Anyhow, for today we stop it here. As we were saying, we will talk about specifically, the Byzantine army, the Western Knights, all this specific also Roman, realities in terms of equipment. But we will see that all. For today, it was just the army organization. So for today, I hope you enjoyed this video. If you did, please share it. Otherwise, leave a like or subscribe to my channel if you're interested in my upcoming content. And I thank you heartily for listening to me. I wish you a nice time and see you next time. Bye.